Welcome back, guys. In this lesson and some of the subsequent lessons coming up, we are going to use more and more asynchronous events inside of a React code, and we're also going to tackle asynchronous event handling with Redux in a pretty close upcoming lesson. But before we do that, I want to take a deeper dive into some of the ways that we've been using some of the asynchronous event handling that we actually get back from Firebase, as well as clarify some of your understanding on promises. Now, the reason for this is because inside of the future applications you build or the companies you join, they may not use this live reload style of event handling that Firebase has provided us using this on snapshot and on auth state changed methods that we've gotten used to inside of our application. Now, I will show you how you can do something similar to what most projects might have, which is a more promise fetch-oriented API using Firebase and our existing database. But first, I just want us to take a look at understanding how it is that this live Firebase style of passing us updates and snapshots and auth state changes actually works. Because this pattern is actually a very common pattern inside of JavaScript world. Not only that, it's actually a very common pattern in the general computer science programming world as a whole, which is the idea of subscriptions. Now, you might have heard of something called observables. You might have heard something called RxJS. You might have even used those libraries before. If you've used Angular at all ever, then you've definitely come across it. But what it is a pattern known as the observer pattern. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. Now, imagine, if you will, this stream of events, right? There's this arrow that represents a almost time linear progress of time, and then each circle here represents some event inside of this timeline. This stream of events is exactly as it is. It's a stream, which means that there are subsequent concurrent back-to-back events that could occur in an asynchronous fashion. I know it sounds really complicated and we're using a lot of terminology here, but in a really basic way, you can just imagine that if there were multiple events that were happening, they just happen in a specific order, right? Based on when they actually occur. So if you were to imagine a stream of user clicks, you can just see this as a user just clicked, right? 2 seconds later, a user clicked again. Half a second later, a user clicked. Maybe 3 seconds later, a user clicked. An indefinite amount of time doesn't matter. They click again, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. That's all a stream of data is. It's just a continuous, ongoing stream of events that are happening. What an observable is it's some piece of code that wraps around this stream so that we're actually able to do something with the value of that piece of data at each event. So for example, if you remember when we were doing our Monsters Rolodex and we had an onClick, in order for us to bind something to a stream of data like that, you can kind of see that there had to be some code implemented in order for us to actually capture that event. And you can see that on this data here, there might be some event data that we want to handle, right, with our code. So all an observer is some piece of code that wraps around this stream of events. The observer is a piece of code that essentially has 3 function calls on it. It has a next call, which is literally just the code that you execute whenever a new event happens. An error call is something that we do when an error occurs. So you can imagine if there was a stream of possible API calls, right, to a backend of some kind, like what we have. And let's say on the 3rd event, our internet goes down or the server crashes or something, right? This will throw an error. We want to have some function that handles errors if that happens. And then a complete call, which is an optional call that will occur if, for example, the stream is finished. Now, do streams finish? Yes, they definitely can. A stream can definitely stop emitting data. Let's say, for example, we know that from our backend, let's say we were getting 5 pieces of data in an unknown amount of time. After we've gotten all 5, we know that we don't need any more data. So we can actually stop listening and shut down this stream because we don't need to keep it open anymore. We got all 5 of our pieces of data that we needed. So because of that, the observable is capable of stopping the stream at some point. And if we have any of these observers, then their complete calls will get called. And how this happens is through what's called a subscription. A subscription is essentially a way for us to tie our code, right, our observer, using what's called a listener. So our observer is listening to these values and we're subscribing to this observer's stream of events. So what we do here with our observer is we're saying, hey, observable, I'm going to give you my function calls. Whenever a new event comes in, I want you to call the next on it. Whenever an error comes in, I want you to call the error. Whenever it completes, I want you to call the complete. And that's all it is. There's essentially just these 3 methods on a single observer that we pass to this stream of data. And then the stream of data, which is the observable, will know, oh, okay, whenever I get a new value inside of my stream, I'm just going to give that to the next function. I'm going to call it again. What this is doing is exactly what we're doing with our auth.onAuth state change call. The function that we've passed to it is pretty much that next function call that we've got here, right? And that auth.onAuth state changed is the stream of events, right? There's some indefinite stream of data on the auth Firebase library where it just doesn't end because users can keep logging in and logging out and logging in and logging in with different users, right? And every time that happens, Firebase sends us and emits to us another piece in that stream, which is that new user logged in or user logged out, right? Whatever it is, Firebase is just sending it to us in a continuous stream. When we pass it this function, we are essentially passing in a very basic observer. This function we've passed it is the next function. So whenever a value comes in, we run our function that we passed to it. The next function you could possibly pass to this call is actually the error call, right? We can actually pass this error function as the second argument and do something with the error if we wanted to. That's just what's available to us on both the auth state changed as well as snapshot. It's just different ways for us to handle our observer pattern using the Firebase library. The complete call very rarely happens inside of Firebase because Firebase is a live database, which means that updates can always happen. There's no point in which Firebase says like, oh, technically speaking, users might stop signing in or signing out, which is why there's no complete callback that we can pass this. But this is pretty much all it is. The moment we pass it a function, we're instantiating some listener, right, on this observable of auth.onAuth state changed. Now, you might wonder, why do we set this unsubscribe? Well, technically speaking, our subscription never ends, right? Because this stream is always open. If we instantiated some listener here, this listener exists now because it's always listening for events. If our component unmounts, we don't care about this listener as far as this component is concerned anymore. But because the auth stream always exists inside of the auth library, which is in our application now, once we imported it in, it's going to always hold on to this listener. What we have to do is we have to unsubscribe from it, right? We need to say, hey, I need you to stop listening to it the moment my component unmounts. The moment our component is off the DOM, This component doesn't exist anymore as far as our app is concerned. So it doesn't need to listen anymore. Firestore allows us to get back an unsubscribe function that the moment we call it, it will eliminate that listener. So you can kind of see it as whenever this gets instantiated, it gives us back some reference. That's a function that can get called that points to this listener that we just instantiated right here. The moment our component unmounts, we will unsubscribe from it. So we're saying, oh, get rid of that listener now. We don't need it anymore. So just unsubscribe. And then once it does that, it destroys the subscription, and then the observable just continues like it always has. An observable can also have any number of listeners. That means that we can have multiple of these observers that all have different next function calls, error function calls, complete function calls. It doesn't matter. The observable just knows that there's going to be different listeners listening to it once it subscribes. The moment it subscribes, the observable gets a reference to this subscription, and it will just call the next whenever it gets a new value, call the error whenever it gets an error, and call the complete whenever it completes. If at any point a piece of code tells the observable, hey, I want to unsubscribe from you, then the observable just takes that reference and throws it out. And it's like, oh, I don't need the subscription anymore, right? I'm just going to continue emitting my events and firing these function calls on all of the other observers that are still listening to me. And that's really all it is. It sounds way more complicated than it does. And I know even with my explanation, it seems rather technical, but that's because of the way that we have to write the code. But that's all you gotta see it as, really, is that it's just some stream of events that we pass some code to it and tell it what to do whenever one of these events occurs. That's really all it is. And then there's a chance that we just don't want to listen to it that anymore, right? So we just unsubscribe from it. Stop listening to that code. Hopefully that gives you a better understanding of this pattern of streams that exists when we use Firebase. Now, because of this, if your application does not run either RxJS, which is a JavaScript library that implements the observable pattern inside of our application, or you're not using Firebase, chances are you're just using regular promises. And in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how we can write very similar code and modify our code base so that we use promises instead of just our observable listener.